Asphalt radiated heat through the thin soles of Renee's flats. She just wanted a bottled water. Instead, she got a wrist lock so tight it tore a rotator cuff, a face full of hot pavement, and a pair of rookies who didn't realize they'd just handcuffed the Justice Department. Cicadas screamed a static wall of noise from the oak trees lining Maplewood Avenue. Sweat pooled at the base of Renee Covington's neck, sticking the collar of her faded grey t-shirt to her skin. 89 degrees in mid-September, with humidity thick enough to chew. She stood beside her charcoal Audi, dragging her thumb across the condensation, bleeding down the sides of her iced Americano. Her brain was still vibrating from a 40-page brief on federal voting rights she'd finalized at 3 in the morning. Right now, she wanted nothing more than the engineered chill of her air-conditioned house, a shower, and 12 uninterrupted hours of sleep. Instead, she was fighting a dead key fob. Renee pressed the unlock button again. Nothing. She sighed a ragged exhale that tasted like stale coffee and exhaustion, and dug her chipped thumbnail into the plastic seam of the fob to pry out the manual key. Her gym bag hung heavy on her left shoulder, the canvas strap cutting into her collarbone. She leaned her hip against the car door, jiggling the thin metal blade into the lock cylinder. It stuck. Of course it stuck. She muttered a sharp, exhausted curse, rattling the handle. Tires crunched over loose gravel behind her. Renee didn't turn immediately. The sound of a car pulling to the curb wasn't inherently dangerous, but the low, idling hum of a heavy engine made the hairs on her arms stand up. She knew that sound. It was the heavy, sluggish idle of a Crown Victoria or a Dodge Charger. A squad car. Step away from the vehicle. The voice was flat, carrying the bored metallic edge of external PA speakers. Renee turned, squinting against the harsh afternoon glare bouncing off the windshield of the cruiser. 2 officers were already out. The driver, a stocky man with a tight, pale buzz cut and a flushed neck, had his hand resting casually on his duty belt, right above his radio. The passenger, younger Lena with restless eyes, was flanking the rear of her Audi. Annoyance flared hot and fast in her chest, overriding any instinct for caution. She was 38 years old, a senior litigator for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and currently operating on 4 hours of sleep. She did not have the patience to play the deferential citizen. "It's my car," Renee said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed the precise cutting projection she used in federal courtrooms. The fob battery died. "I said step away from the vehicle, ma'am." The older officer, his name tag, read. Gantry closed the distance by 3 paces. The heavy squeak of his leather boots on the asphalt seemed obscenely loud. Renee didn't move. She just stared at him. She recognized the posture. The wide stance, the rolled shoulders, the subtle angling of the hip to protect the firearm while projecting mass. It was a posture she had cross-examined 100 times in deposition rooms. It was the body language of a man who had already made up his mind. "I heard you," Renee said, her tone dripping with a condescension she didn't bother to hide. "And I'm telling you I live 3 blocks from here. This is my car. I'm trying to go home." "We got a call about a suspicious individual casing vehicles on this block," the younger officer chirped from the rear bumper. He had a nervous energy, his weight shifting from foot to foot. Renee let out a short, humorless laugh. "Casing vehicles, at 2 in the afternoon, in a Georgetown sweatshirt." She gestured to her chest. "Does this look like a heist to you?" "Drop the attitude," Gantry snapped. The redness in his neck crept up his jawline. The smell of hot brakes and ozone drifted from their idling cruiser, mixing with the sweet, cloying scent of cut grass from a nearby lawn. "Do you have identification?" "My wallet is in the console, inside the car." Renee pointed a manicured finger at the locked door. which I am trying to open. Keep your hands where I can see them, Gantry ordered, his voice dropping an octave. The casual hand on the belt shifted, the fingers curling slightly. Renee's legal brain, the cold, analytical machine that paid her mortgage, began ticking off the violations. Terry versus Ohio. No reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime is afoot. Fourth Amendment. Unlawful detention. But the human part of her, the exhausted black woman standing on a hot sidewalk in a wealthy suburb, was just intensely, purely angry. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, turning her back to Gantry to try the manual key one more time. It was a stupid, impulsive move, born of sheer fatigue. She just wanted to sit down. "Hey." The shout was abrupt, guttural. Heavy boots pounded the pavement. Before Renee could even register the shift in the air, a thick, calloused hand clamped down on her left shoulder fingers, digging brutally into her bicep. The iced Americano slipped from her grasp. The plastic cup hit the curb, bursting open with a wet crack. Brown liquid and ice cubes scattered across the toes of her shoes. "Don't touch me!" Renee snarled, her body reacting on pure instinct. She jerked her arm forward, trying to break his grip. It was the exact excuse Gantry was waiting for. The world tilted violently. Gantry didn't just grab her. He used her own momentum against her, twisting her left arm backward and upward in a textbook compliance hold. White-hot pain shot through Renee's shoulder socket, a sharp tearing sensation that stole the breath straight from her lungs. She gasped, a jagged sound that felt foreign in her throat. "Stop resisting," Gantry bellowed the volume, unnecessary theatrical. He was performing for the dash cam. "I'm not—" The rest of her sentence was crushed out of her as a second pair of hands seized her right arm. The younger cop, the nervous one. He slammed his weight into her back. Renee's knees buckled. The coarse grain of the asphalt rushed up to meet her. She turned her head at the last second, taking the impact on her right cheekbone instead of her nose. Grit bit deep into her skin. The smell of oil dirt and sun-baked tar filled her nostrils, suffocating and hot. Her glasses twisted off her face, the frames digging painfully into the bridge of her nose before snapping away and skittering under the car. "Get your hands behind your back." Renee couldn't. Gantry had her left arm pinned so high between her shoulder blades, she was certain the joint was dislocated. Her right arm was trapped under her own torso. The sheer weight of the two men pressing her into the ground made it impossible to inflate her lungs. Panic, cold and primal, spiked through her chest. She was a DOJ litigator. She broke police departments for a living. She drafted consent decrees that stripped cities of their budgets and forced federal monitors down the throats of corrupt precincts. She knew the law better than the men currently grinding her face into the dirt. But right now, none of that mattered. The law was abstract. The knee driving into her lower spine was real. "Get off me!" she screamed, her voice cracking. It wasn't a commanding, authoritative order. It was a raw, terrified shriek. She hated herself for it instantly. She kicked her legs out her flats, scraping against the pavement, trying to find leverage to breathe. "She's fighting!" the younger cop yelled, his voice pitched high with adrenaline. "Stop resisting or you will be tased!" Gantry shouted, his face inches from her ear. She could smell his breath, stale tobacco and sour coffee. "Don't move," her rational brain screamed at her body. "If you move, they will kill you and call it a struggle." She forced her muscles to go limp. It took her every ounce of willpower she possessed to stop fighting the pain in her shoulder, to just lie there and let them hurt her. She went dead weight. "I am not moving," Renee gasped out, her mouth tasting copper. She had bitten her tongue when she hit the ground. "I am not resisting." The pressure on her back didn't ease. Gantry yanked her right arm out from under her with brutal force. Cold, heavy metal bit into her left wrist. The ratcheting click of the handcuffs sounded incredibly loud in the heavy summer air. He wrenched her right wrist back to meet the left. The metal pinched the delicate skin over her veins, clamped shut so tightly her fingers immediately began to tingle. "Suspect is secured," Gantry said, panting slightly. The weight lifted off her back. Rough hands grabbed her by the biceps and hauled her to her knees, then to her feet. The sudden shift in elevation made her vision swim. Black spots danced at the edges of her sight. Her shoulder throbbed with a sickening, heavy pulse. Renee stood there, swaying, slightly handcuffed behind her back, her shirt stained with sweat and dirt. Her cheek felt sticky. Blood. Gantry looked her up and down, his chest heaving. He was adjusting his duty belt, regaining his composure. "You have the right to remain silent. Save it." Renee spat the blood in her mouth, making her lisp slightly. The initial shock was receding, leaving behind a cold, crystalline fury. The kind of fury that built cases. You didn't see a crime. You had no reasonable suspicion. You assaulted me. You were ordered to step away from the vehicle. Gantry said, his tone shifting into the flat, bureaucratic voice cops use when they know they're being recorded. You refused a lawful order, attempted to evade, and physically resisted officers. I pulled my arm away from a battery. She countered, her voice shaking, but her diction precise. "And what's the charge exactly? What are you arresting me for?" Gantry hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was the micro-expression of a man who realized he had escalated a situation without a foundational crime and was now scrambling for the catch-all. "Disorderly conduct," he said firmly, "and resisting arrest." Renee barked a laugh, though it hurt her bruised ribs. "Resisting arrest for what you can't resist an arrest if there's no underlying charge, Officer Gantry. Disorderly conduct is a garbage statute you use when you want to punish someone for contempt of cop. You know it, and I know it." The younger officer picked up her broken glasses from the gutter, looking at them, then at her. He suddenly looked very young and very unsure. "Get her in the car," Gantry snapped. They walked her to the cruiser. The younger cop opened the rear door and pushed down on her head to guide her inside. The back seat of the Crown Vic was a cage of molded hard plastic. It smelled overwhelmingly of pine sol, old sweat and vomit. The heat inside was stifling the vinyl radiating the afternoon sun. Renee slid awkwardly across the slick seat, unable to use her hands to brace herself. The door slammed shut, sealing her in a soundproof box. Through the thick, reinforced glass, she watched Gantry walk over to her Audi. He peered through the driver's side window. He was looking for something in plain sight. Contraband, a weapon, anything to retroactively justify what he had just done. He wouldn't find anything. Renee leaned her head back against the hard plastic partition. The pain in her shoulder was a dull, constant roar. The handcuffs were cutting off the circulation to her hands. Her fingers were entirely numb. She closed her eyes, feeling the sticky trail of blood drying on her cheek. She wasn't crying. She was too angry to cry. She imagined the deposition. She imagined sitting across from Gantry in a sterile conference room. She imagined methodically, ruthlessly tearing his career apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but his pension. And she'd take that too. But as she sat baking in the back of the squad car, bloodied and bound, the cynical truth gnawed at her. She was a senior litigator for the DOJ. She had the power of the federal government behind her, and it hadn't protected her from a single second of this. Motion sickness rolled through Renee's stomach with every erratic tap of the brakes. Gantry drove the way he policed, aggressively, impatiently, taking corners too sharp and accelerating toward red lights just to hit the pads hard at the last possible second. Each sudden deceleration threw Renee forward her injured shoulder, absorbing the shock against the hard plastic partition, separating the front cab from the rear. She couldn't brace herself. Her hands, locked tight behind her back, were entirely devoid of sensation. Now the numbness creeping past her wrists and into her forearms. Sweat dripped down her ribs under the thin cotton of her t-shirt. The air conditioning in the Crown Victoria was blasting up front, but back here, in the moulded plastic cage, it was a humid incubator, smelling of stale pine disinfectant and ancient vomit. Dust motes danced in the shafts of harsh afternoon sunlight slicing through the reinforced windows. She watched the back of Gantry's pale, thick neck. He was talking to the younger officer Dunn. She'd gleaned from a passing comment, but the plexiglass muffled their voices into a low, indistinguishable drone of self-justification. Anger had sustained her on the pavement, a hot, protective fire that kept the fear at bay. Now, sitting trapped in the sweltering back seat, that fire was burning down into a cold, heavy ash. The reality of her physical vulnerability was setting in. If Gantry decided to pull down a deserted alley instead of heading to the precinct, there was absolutely nothing she could do. She was a black woman, handcuffed in the back of a police cruiser, entirely at the mercy of a man whose pride she had just bruised. Her resume meant nothing here. Her Ivy League degree was not armor. They turned sharply, the tires squealing against concrete, and plunged into the artificial twilight of an underground sally port. The heavy steel garage doors rattled shut behind them, sealing off the bright September afternoon. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly greenish pallor over the concrete walls. Gantry killed the engine. The sudden silence in the rear of the cruiser was suffocating. The rear door clicked open, and heavy, humid garage air rushed in, mixing with the smell of exhaust fumes. "Out!" Gantry barked, stepping back. Renee scooted awkwardly across the slick vinyl seat. Her legs felt weak, the adrenaline crash beginning to tremble in her thighs. As she tried to swing her feet out, her shoe caught the edge of the doorframe. She stumbled forward. Before she could catch her balance, Gantry's hand closed around her right bicep, hauling her upright with unnecessary force. The movement wrenched her left shoulder again, and a sharp, involuntary hiss escaped her teeth. "Walk," he instructed, shoving her lightly toward a heavy metal door labeled Processing. Inside the precinct smelled overwhelmingly of industrial floor wax, cheap coffee, and the sharp metallic tang of unwashed bodies. Telephones rang in a chaotic, overlapping chorus. Uniformed officers moved through the narrow hallways with the practiced, bored apathy of factory workers on an assembly line. Nobody looked at her. Nobody saw a senior federal litigator dragged in bleeding. They saw just another body. Just another file number for the shift. Sergeant Riley sat behind the elevated booking desk, a massive man with a graying mustache and tired, pouchy eyes. He didn't look up from his computer monitor as Gantry and Dunn marched her to the yellow line painted on the scuffed linoleum. "What you got?" Riley mumbled, typing slowly with two thick index fingers. "Disorderly resisting?" Gantry said, dropping her canvas gym bag heavily onto the counter. Subject refused lawful orders, became combative during a Terry stop. Riley finally lifted his eyes. He took in Renee's disheveled appearance, the dirt smeared across her cheek, the dried blood from her lip, the professional-grade Georgetown sweatshirt now stained and stretched. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on the sharp, furious intelligence in her eyes, then flicked back to his screen. He had seen 1,000 angry people. He didn't care. "Name?" Riley asked. "Renee Covington," she said. Her voice was hoarse, her throat dry from the suffocating heat of the squad car. "And I want my phone. I am legally entitled to contact my counsel." Riley sighed a long, wet sound and reached for her gym bag. "You'll get your call when processing is done, Covington. Empty your pockets." "I don't have pockets. I'm wearing leggings." "Take off your shoes." She kicked off her ruined flats. The cold linoleum seeped through her thin socks. Dunn stepped forward, moving with a twitchy, nervous hesitation, and unlocked the handcuffs. The release of pressure was almost as agonizing as the cuffs themselves. Blood rushed back into her hands in a painful, agonizing wave of pins and needles. She brought her arms forward, slowly cradling her left elbow. Her wrists were ringed with deep, angry red indentations, the skin bruised purple along the bone. Riley unzipped her gym bag and began dumping the contents onto the stainless steel counter. Her running shoes, a water bottle, her leather wallet, her Department of Justice credentials. Renee watched Riley's thick fingers flip open the leather case. The gold DOJ shield caught the harsh fluorescent light. Riley stopped. He stared at the ID card, then at her face, then back at the ID. The rhythmic typing in the room seemed to pause for a microsecond. "You work for the Justice Department?" Riley asked, his voice dropping its bored, bureaucratic drone. Gantry leaned over the counter, peering at the badge. The color drained out of his flushed neck with remarkable speed. "She didn't say anything about that." "I told you I was a lawyer," Renee said, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register. "I told you I lived 3 blocks away. You didn't care. You wanted to play tough guy on a residential street." Riley closed the wallet slowly. He looked at Gantry, a silent, damning communication passing between the two veterans. Gantry had brought a wolf into the sheep pen, and worse, he had roughed it up. But the machine was already in motion. The arrest report was open. You couldn't just unarrest someone once they crossed the booking desk. The bureaucracy had to feed. "Step over to the wall for your photos, Ms. Covington," Riley said, his tone abruptly shifting to a tense, rigid politeness. The use of Ms. was telling. They took her mugshot. Left profile, right profile, straight on. The flash blinded her, capturing the dirt, the blood and the utter exhausted contempt radiating from her face. They rolled her fingers in thick black ink, pressing them onto the scanner. It was a methodical stripping of dignity, a systematic reduction of a human being into a series of data points and criminal codes. When they finally led her toward the holding cells, Gantry didn't follow. He hung back by the desk, staring at the floor, suddenly looking very small in his uniform. Renee didn't look back at him. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on the heavy iron bars approaching at the end of the hall. Cold radiated from the concrete block. Renee sat on the narrow stainless steel bench, bolted to the wall of the holding cell. The air conditioning in this part of the precinct was brutal, blowing directly from a ceiling vent covered in layers of grey dust. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs to conserve body heat. Her left shoulder throbbed with a sickening rhythmic pulse that matched her heartbeat. The cell was a sensory nightmare. The metallic tang of rust and dried urine clung to the back of her throat. Somewhere down the hall, a drunk was singing off-key, the lyrics echoing harshly against the cinder-block walls. To her right, a stainless steel toilet sat fully exposed, the water inside a murky, suspicious grey. Time distorted in the windowless room. It could have been 20 minutes or 3 hours since they locked the heavy sliding grate behind her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the arrest and processing had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. She rested her forehead against her knees. She was a DOJ litigator. She negotiated with police chiefs. She lectured at academies on de-escalation and constitutional policing. She knew the statistics. She knew the exact percentage of excessive force complaints that were sustained versus dismissed. She knew the law, and it was entirely useless. The realization sat heavy in her gut, a sour, undeniable truth. When Gantry's hand clamped down on her, her knowledge of Graham versus Connor hadn't stopped the bruising. Her understanding of the Fourth Amendment hadn't kept her face from hitting the asphalt. In that terrible, violent geometry between a police officer and a civilian, the law didn't exist. Only force existed. A heavy set of keys rattled at the end of the corridor. Boot steps approached, slow and deliberate. Officer Dunn appeared on the other side of the bars. He wasn't meeting her eyes. He stared firmly at the heavy lock mechanism as he slid the key in. Phone call. He muttered his voice, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. Renee stood up. Her joints popped, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She steadied herself against the cold painted cinder block wall. Dunn opened the door and stepped back, giving her an unusually wide berth. He was afraid of her now. He had seen the DOJ badge. He realized he had just helped assault a federal attorney, and the career preservation instincts were kicking in. "Don't touch me," she said quietly as she walked past him. Dunn swallowed hard and pointed down the hall. "Phones are on the wall by the water fountain. Dial 9 to get out." The phone bank consisted of 3 heavy metal receivers attached to short armored cords. The plastic was greasy slick with the sweat of 1,000 desperate people who had stood in this exact spot. Renee picked up the receiver with her right hand, her left arm hanging uselessly at her side. She dialed the number from muscle memory, pressing the metal keypad buttons with her thumb. It rang twice. "Claire Vance's office, this is Claire." The voice was crisp professional and blessedly familiar. "Claire, it's Renee." "Renee, I thought you were taking the afternoon off. We just got the revisions back from the appellate team on the I'm in central booking." The line went dead silent. Renee could picture her colleague sitting in her pristine glass-walled office in D.C., freezing mid-sentence, her hand hovering over a keyboard. "Excuse me," Claire finally asked, the professional veneer slipping into utter confusion. "Central booking, as in jail." "Yes." Renee closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the cool, grimy metal of the phone enclosure. The reality of saying it out loud cracked the protective shell she had been holding together since the pavement. Her voice wavered a pathetic trembling sound she despised. "I need you to come get me. And I need you to call Arthur." "Are you okay, Renee? What happened? Were you in an accident?" Claire's voice was rising in pitch, the panic bleeding through the receiver. "I was trying to open my car door," Renee said. A tear broke loose, tracking hotly through the dirt and dried blood on her cheek. She swiped at it viciously with the back of her wrist. 2 patrol officers rolled up. They decided I was casing cars. "You, in your own neighborhood." "They grabbed me, Claire. They slammed me into the ground. They cuffed me." She was breathing too fast now. The panic, the sheer helpless terror of the physical assault was crashing back over her. "My shoulder is messed up. I think they dislocated it. They charged me with disorderly conduct to cover their asses." "Jesus Christ," Claire breathed. The sound of a chair scraping violently against a floor echoed over the line. "I'm leaving right now. I'm calling Arthur. I'm calling the union rep. I'm calling everybody. Do not say a goddamn word to anyone there. Do you hear me?" "I know," Renee whispered. "I know how this works." "Which precinct?" 14th District, Maplewood Avenue." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Claire promised, her voice hardening into the sharp, lethal tone she used during cross-examinations. "Hang tight, Renee. We're coming." The line clicked dead. The dial tone buzzed harshly in Renee's ear. She hung up the receiver slowly. The phone call should have made her feel better. The cavalry was coming. By tonight, the 14th District would be dealing with a shitstorm of federal proportions. Gantry would be suspended. The charges would be dropped before the ink dried on the booking sheet. But as Dunn escorted her back down the bleak, fluorescent-lit hallway, returning her to the cold concrete cell, none of that mattered. She sat back down on the hard metal bench, the heavy door sliding shut with a sickening final clang. She crossed her arms, shivering uncontrollably in the air-conditioned chill. The DOJ could protect her career. They could punish the men who did this. But they couldn't undo the last 2 hours. They couldn't erase the memory of Gantry's hot breath on her neck, the smell of the asphalt, or the terrifying, absolute realization of her own powerlessness. In the eyes of the system she served, she wasn't a lawyer. She was just another black woman who didn't know her place. The ambient noise of the precinct shifted subtly before the physical reality of her rescue materialized. The low, constant hum of bureaucratic apathy, ringing phones, the clack of heavy keyboards, the muffled shouts from the drunk tank was suddenly pierced by the sharp, authoritative click of hard-soled leather shoes on linoleum. It wasn't the heavy rubber-soled squeak of police boots. It was the sound of money access and impending institutional violence. Renee lifted her head from her knees. The cinder-block wall leached the last remaining warmth from her right shoulder. Her left arm hung entirely numb, a heavy dead appendage attached to a joint that screamed with a white-hot, grinding friction every time she inhaled. Footsteps stopped outside the heavy sliding grate. It wasn't done this time. A man in a tailored charcoal grey suit stood on the other side of the bars. Arthur Pendleton, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division. He was 62, a veteran of the department who possessed the calm, terrifying stillness of a man who routinely dismantled state governments. Beside him stood Claire Belmont, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe, messy knot, a heavy canvas tote bag slung over the shoulder of her silk blouse. She looked breathless, her jaw tight, her eyes scanning the dim, urine-scented holding cell before locking on to Renee. Arthur didn't say a word to Renee. He didn't offer a platitude. He just stared at her bruised face, the dirt smeared into her hairline, the awkward, unnatural angle of her left arm. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He turned his head slowly to look at the uniformed captain standing nervously 2 paces behind him. "Open it," Arthur said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the devastating weight of a federal subpoena. The captain, a thick-necked man named Russo, whose uniform shirt suddenly looked 2 sizes too small, fumbled with the heavy ring of keys. The metal clanged loudly, echoing down the corridor. The grate slid open with a screech of unoiled iron. Claire bypassed the captain, entirely stepping into the cell. She didn't hug Renee. She was smart enough to see the protective, feral hunch of Renee's posture. Instead, she knelt in front of the metal bench, her silk blouse brushing against the filthy concrete floor. "Can you walk?" Claire asked, her voice tight, maintaining a clinical distance to keep them both from breaking down. "Yes," Renee croaked. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. She stood up. The sudden drop in blood pressure sent black static swimming across her vision. She swayed her good hand, gripping the edge of the stainless steel bench to anchor herself. Claire hovered her hands inches from Renee's elbows, ready to catch her, but didn't make contact. Renee forced herself to walk out of the cell. She didn't look at Captain Russo. She didn't look at Arthur. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, focusing on placing 1 foot in front of the other. The walk down the corridor felt like navigating a mile of quicksand. Every step jarred her shoulder, sending sickening pulses of pain radiating up her neck and down into her ribs. When they reached the booking desk, the atmosphere was thick, stifling, and utterly silent. Sergeant Riley, the desk officer, who had processed her with such bored contempt 2 hours ago, was standing rigidly behind his computer. Officer Dunn was nowhere to be seen. Gantry was gone. "Her belongings," Arthur ordered, resting both palms flat on the high booking counter. Riley pushed the clear plastic evidence bag across the metal surface. It contained her phone, her keys, her wallet, and her DOJ credentials. The gold shield pressed against the plastic looked dull under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Sign here," Riley mumbled, sliding a clipboard across the counter. It was a property release form. Renee stared at the cheap, chewed-up ballpoint pen attached to the clipboard by a grimy string. She reached for it with her right hand. Her fingers were trembling so violently she couldn't grip the plastic barrel. The fine motor skills necessary to sign her name were completely gone, hijacked by the massive dump of adrenaline and cortisol still flooding her nervous system. She tried to press the pen to the paper, but it just skipped, leaving a jagged, illegible scratch across the signature line. A heavy, humiliating silence fell over the room. Arthur reached out and gently took the pen from her shaking hand. He looked at Captain Russo, his eyes flat and dead. "She's not signing anything. I am taking custody of her property. You will release her on her own recognizance immediately." And Captain Russo swallowed audibly. "Yes, sir. You will preserve all body camera footage, dash camera footage, holding cell video and radio dispatch logs from the 14th District for the last 12 hours. If a single frame of data goes missing, I will personally see to it that the FBI executes a search warrant on this building by morning. The footage is already locked in evidence. Mr. Pendleton," Russo said hastily, the sweat visible on his forehead. "The charges are being dropped. It was a misunderstanding on the street level." Renee let out a short, wet laugh that sounded more like a cough. The sound cut through the tense quiet of the booking room like a gunshot. "A misunderstanding," she rasped, looking up at Russo. Her voice was weak, but the pure, concentrated venom behind it made the captain flinch. "I'm sure that will look fantastic on the incident report." She didn't wait for a response. She grabbed the plastic evidence bag with her good hand, the plastic crinkling loudly, and turned away from the desk. She walked toward the heavy glass double doors leading out to the lobby. The air in the precinct felt heavy, suffocating, saturated with the smell of floor wax and fear. Her own people had arrived. The system she worked for had flexed its considerable muscle to pull her out of the machine. The charges were gone. The paperwork was erased. But as she pushed her good shoulder against the heavy glass door, stepping out into the fading evening light, the profound, cynical truth settled into her bones. The only reason she was walking out the front door instead of being transferred to central lockup was her badge. The law hadn't saved her. Arthur's title had saved her. She was a black woman who had been assaulted on the street for the crime of standing near her own car. And the only thing that made her different from the hundreds of other people processed through that desk every week was the fact that she worked for the people who could destroy them. It wasn't justice. It was just a bigger stick. The transition from the aggressively air-conditioned precinct to the muggy September evening was a physical shock. The air smelled of exhausted hot asphalt and the distant damp promise of a thunderstorm. The sky above the city was bruising into a deep purple twilight. Claire's silver Lexus was parked illegally in a spot reserved for squad cars, its hazard lights blinking rhythmically. The engine was running. "I'm taking you to George Washington University Hospital," Claire said, falling into step beside her. She reached out, finally making physical contact, gently guiding Renee's right elbow toward the passenger door. "Arthur is staying behind to make sure Russo files the preservation orders. He's already calling the head of the civil division." "I just want to go home," Renee mumbled, stopping at the edge of the curb. The pavement beneath her feet felt unsteady, rolling like the deck of a ship. She stared at the pristine beige leather interior of Claire's car. She looked down at her own clothes. Her Georgetown sweatshirt was torn at the collar, stained with dirt oil, and drops of her own dried blood. "I'm going to ruin your seats. Renee, get in the goddamn car," Claire said, her professional veneer finally cracking, revealing a raw, jagged edge of panic. "Your shoulder is sitting 3 inches lower than it should be. You're bleeding. Get in." Renee didn't argue. She lowered herself into the passenger seat, moving with agonizing slowness. She couldn't lean back. The pressure against her left shoulder blade sent a sickening wave of nausea crashing over her. She sat hunched forward, cradling her injured arm against her stomach, her breath coming in short, shallow, hitching sounds. Claire shut the door, hurried around to the driver's side, and slid behind the wheel. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, accelerating harshly. The interior of the Lexus smelled of expensive vanilla air freshener and sanitized leather. It was a violent contrast to the stale pine and vomit of Gantry's cruiser. Classical music played softly from the speakers, a meticulously curated Spotify playlist designed to reduce stress in traffic. It felt absurd. It felt like a sick joke. Streetlights strobed across the windshield, casting rhythmic, moving shadows across the dashboard. Renee stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of her city blur past. She saw people walking their dogs, couples carrying takeout bags, teenagers clustered outside a corner store. The world had kept spinning while she was locked in a concrete box. Nobody knew. Nobody cared. "We're going to bury him," Claire said quietly, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. "Gantry. We have his name. Arthur is already pulling his jacket. We're going to find every excessive force complaint, every disciplinary write-up, every internal affairs investigation they buried. We are going to take his badge, his pension, and we're going to refer him for federal prosecution." Renee closed her eyes. The pulsing ache in her shoulder was becoming deafening, crowding out her ability to form coherent thoughts. "It doesn't matter," Renee whispered. "Of course it matters," Claire snapped, glancing quickly across the center console. "He assaulted a federal attorney. He violated your civil rights. We make an example out of him. That's what we do, Claire." Renee opened her eyes and turned her head slowly, the muscles in her neck stiff and bruised. "He didn't know I was a federal attorney when he grabbed me. He thought I was just some woman. Some black woman in a hoodie, trying to steal a car in a nice neighborhood." Claire opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, the silence heavy and thick between them. "If I didn't have that badge in my bag," Renee continued, her voice devoid of emotion, hollowed out by exhaustion. "If I was a teacher or a nurse or a barista, I'd be sitting in central booking right now. I'd be facing a magistrate tomorrow morning for resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer, and no one would care. It wouldn't make the news. The system would just grind me up." She looked back out the window. The illuminated red sign for the GW Hospital emergency room was glowing in the distance. "We draft consent decrees, Claire. We mandate implicit bias training. We force them to wear body cameras. And none of it means a damn thing when a guy with a gun decides you don't belong on his street." They pulled into the ambulance bay. Claire threw the car into park and killed the engine. She didn't get out immediately. She sat perfectly still, staring at the bright red brick of the hospital wall. For all her legal brilliance, all her Ivy League pedigree, Claire had no framework for this. She could litigate the trauma, but she couldn't understand it. "Let's get you inside," Claire finally said, her voice thick. The emergency room was a chaotic mess of fluorescent lights, the smell of bleach, and the low groans of the waiting wounded. But they didn't have to wait. Arthur had made the call. A triage nurse was waiting for them at the front desk, bypassing the crowded waiting area, leading Renee straight into a private trauma bay, behind a heavy curtain. A doctor in blue scrubs entered a moment later. He asked the standard questions. He moved with clinical efficiency. "I need to cut the shirt, Ms. Covington," the doctor said, holding up a pair of heavy trauma shears. "Taking it off over your head will risk further damage to the joint." Renee nodded mutely. The shears bit into the heavy cotton of her Georgetown sweatshirt. The sound of the fabric tearing was loud in the small space. The doctor cut straight up the middle, peeling the ruined fabric away from her skin, exposing the dirt, the scraped skin, and the massive, blooming purple bruise spreading across her left shoulder and collarbone. The cold air of the hospital room hit her bare skin. She shivered, wrapping her good arm around her ribs. She looked at her reflection in the small stainless steel mirror mounted above the sink. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. The polished, untouchable senior litigator was gone left somewhere on the hot asphalt of Maplewood Avenue. In her place was just a battered body shivering under fluorescent lights, realizing that the armor she had spent her entire life building was made of paper. The doctor's hands were double-gloved, smelling sharply of nitrile and harsh industrial antibacterial soap. He pushed a dose of IV fentanyl into the bruised vein on the back of her right hand. The cold chemical flush of the narcotic rushed up her arm, blooming directly behind her eyes in a heavy metallic fog. It blunted the sharpest, most jagged edges of her panic, but it left the bone-deep exhaustion entirely intact. Pop! The sound of the shoulder joint snapping back into the socket echoed through the wet tissue of her own skull before the pain even registered. When it did, it was a blinding, white-hot flare that forced a guttural, wet, and completely undignified groan from her throat. She bit down hard on her lower lip, instantly tasting the familiar metallic tang of copper from where she'd cut it on the asphalt hours ago. "There we go," the attending doctor murmured, his voice muffled and distant behind a pale blue surgical mask. He stepped closer, producing a roll of thick tape, and began wrapping her chest and left arm in tight, restrictive layers of white elastic bandage. It was a uniquely humiliating sort of intimacy. Stripped of her ruined clothes, wrapped in gauze, she was reduced to mere anatomy, a problem to be immobilized. Claire sat in the far corner of the trauma bay, on a hard plastic chair, aggressively scrolling through her phone, granting Renee a desperate, thin illusion of privacy. The steady rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound tethering her to the physical room. It was approaching 3 a.m. when the black town car Arthur had ordered dropped her off at the edge of her driveway. Claire had offered to stay to sleep on her couch, but Renee had refused. Her rejection had come out with a brittle, defensive sharpness that left them both retreating into an uncomfortable silence. The night air was sticky, heavy, with the unfulfilled threat of a late summer thunderstorm. Crickets chirped in a frantic chorus from the manicured azalea bushes lining her walkway. Renee stood on the concrete sidewalk for a long minute, staring at the empty dark spot where her Audi usually sat. Someone from the 14th district had likely impounded it or towed it to a municipal lot. She didn't have the energy to care. It was just a car. Unlocking her front door with her non-dominant hand took 3 agonizing tries. Her fine motor skills were completely shot. Inside her house was perfectly infuriatingly quiet. It smelled of eucalyptus reeds, old hardwood polish, and the faint, dusty chill of the central air conditioning. It was a sanctuary she had bought with a decade of 70-hour work weeks, a fortress of upper-middle-class security. Right now it felt like a museum exhibit she wasn't supposed to touch. She walked into the kitchen, the dark, hardwood floor, freezing against her bare feet. She hadn't put her shoes back on at the hospital. They were ruined, stained with blood and spilled coffee. She was wearing hospital-issue yellow grip socks and a massive, oversized grey t-shirt Claire had purchased from the 24-hour gift shop in the lobby. The red digital clock on her stainless steel oven blinked 3:14. She reached for a water glass from the upper cabinet, but stopped mid-motion, her right hand hovering uselessly in the air. The heavy, immobilizing sling strapped tight across her chest threw her center of gravity entirely off. Reaching up made the muscles in her ribs seize in protest. She abandoned the glass. Instead, she leaned over the heavy marble basin of the sink, turned on the tap, and cupped cold water into her good hand, drinking it like a stray dog. Water splashed down her chin, soaking the collar of the cheap cotton shirt. She just leaned her hips against the cool marble of the counter, staring at the humming refrigerator. The low vibration of the compressor sounded absolutely deafening in the empty house. Her work laptop sat on the mahogany dining room table, exactly where she had left it 14 hours ago. Next to it was the 90-page binder on the federal voting rights case, neatly tabbed with color-coded sticky notes. She walked over and tapped the spacebar. The screen flared to life, instantly illuminating the dark room with a harsh, bluish-white glare. 84 unread emails. Arthur had been busy. Subject lines flashed across her inbox like artillery fire. Urgent 14th District Preservation Order. Litigation. Hold Officer Thomas Gantry. Draft Civil Rights Division. Internal memo. The machine was doing exactly what it was built to do. It was grinding its massive gears, preparing to crush the men who had embarrassed it. She clicked on a PDF attachment from one of Arthur's paralegals. It was the initial incident report, pulled directly from the local precinct's database before Captain Russo could scrub or amend it. Renee scrolled down slowly with her trackpad, her eyes scanning the dense blocks of text. Subject observed lingering near high-value vehicle. Subject matched description of individuals involved in recent string of catalytic converter thefts in the immediate area. When approached, subject became instantly belligerent, refusing lawful commands to step back. Subject aggressively lunged away, necessitating physical control to prevent flight. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. Passive voice, sanitized violence, necessitating physical control. That was the heavy knee driving into her lumbar spine. Aggressively lunged away. That was her trying to stand up after dropping her iced coffee, attempting to preserve a shred of her own bodily autonomy. She knew this language intimately. She had cross-examined police captains on these exact phrases 100 times. She knew how to pick apart the subtle inconsistencies, how to corner them on the witness stand until the lies collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. But reading it now, seeing her own physical trauma neatly packaged into municipal codes and sanitized bulletproof police speak, made her stomach violently hollow. They had written this narrative before they knew who she was. They had written it, knowing that a county magistrate would read it tomorrow morning, nod without looking up, and set bail at $5,000. Renee closed the laptop. The screen went black. The sudden darkness in the dining room was a profound physical relief. She walked into the living room and sank into the deep plush cushions of her sofa. Her shoulder throbbed a dull, rhythmic ache, pressing outward against the tightness of the bandages. She pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin awkwardly on her good forearm. Tomorrow Arthur would call. The FBI would likely open a preliminary civil rights investigation. She would have to give a formal sworn statement. She would sit across a polished conference table from federal investigators and recount the smell of the hot asphalt, the suffocating heat of the squad car, the terrible ratcheting click of the handcuffs. She would put her armor back on. She would use her Ivy League vocabulary, her sharp, tailored suits, and her federal authority to completely destroy Thomas Gantry's life. She would win. She knew that. She had the entire weight of the United States government behind her. But as she sat in the perfect, expensive silence of her home, watching the first grey, anemic hints of dawn creep through the slats of the plantation shutters, she knew exactly what she had lost. The case would close, the officers would